right? Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's 20 past, so I'm just gonna get started. All right. So yeah, no title slides because I have my own, but I still wanted to include this nice graphic of the city of Ghent, and this one from where I work. But I hope y'all aren't too hungry because today we're going to be talking about pizza. So I know it's nearly dinner time, but please bear with me. So we're going to be talking about the handler system in core and how it's inflexible and how I had to reinvent it in group in order to be able to achieve what I wanted to. So before we get started, who's cooking today? It's me, kristiaanvandeneynde. My full name is also my handle on Drupal.org without the spaces, so that's easy. I am the author and the maintainer of the group module. I work remotely for Factorial, which is a German company based out of Hamburg. I do live around Antwerp, Belgium, like the north of Antwerp. I move around a little bit, but generally around Antwerp. And I'm a highly sensitive person. I always put that on one of my first slides. It basically means that whatever your brain does, it does so in overdrive. So if you're angry, you're really angry. If you're sad, you're really sad. But it also means that if someone touches you, it feels like they're pushing you. If you taste something, it feels like your mouth is full of that flavor. It has benefits. It also has downsides. One of the downsides is that I used to get a lot of panic attacks because the world was too overwhelming. That's why I always put it in my slides, just to share that if something does happen, I'm not having a heart attack or a stroke. Well, hopefully, let's touch wood. But I'm just experiencing one of those episodes. I haven't experienced many of them lately, so that's cool, but still mention it. So today we're going to be talking about, or we're going to be telling the story of a frustrated chef. So let's imagine that the pizza place in the opening slide is your website and you're the chef, right? So in your pizzeria, it's all about being able to make your pizza. Like you don't want your pizza to be the same like anyone else's. You want it to be yours. Same with your website. You install Drupal, you install a bunch of modules, but in the end, it's going to be your website specific to that client or your own business. So out of the box, you usually get something bland, like your pizza base, and you want to do something with that. Okay, cool. Let's start cooking. So let's add some tomato sauce and see what happens. Cool, works. Nothing too fancy. But obviously, that's not a full pizza yet, so we have to continue. So let's add some topping to our result that we just had, and the screen's gone. Hello? Okay, there we go. So let's do that. Now, the expected result would be a tasty pizza, but we get this monstrosity. So what happened? Where did our tomato sauce go? Because we were expecting this. Well, essentially, your pizza got ruined because Drupal doesn't like pizza. That's the morale of this story. So yeah, that makes me sad. Um, so now, obviously, as a chef, you're wondering like, why can't I make my pizza, right? What is this guy talking about? Well, to be able to explain that, we first need to look at the handler system in core. So the handler system in core is something used by entity types. You've all seen it, you've all used it. When you try to load an entity, you use that storage, right? So you define those in the entity type annotation. Out of the box, you get some for free, but nothing stops you from creating your own handler type and then adding that to an annotation or other entities annotations. You can do that at will. But essentially, it's just a string that points towards a class somewhere, and that's it. It's just a magical string. So if you want to change that string or the pointer to that class, you can do so using this hook. Now, let's look at an example of a storage handler, for instance, for those who don't know yet, but I'm assuming everyone in the room does. So these are some of the handlers for the node entity type. And you can see that you have a string called storage that points to a class node storage. Now, if I want to change something, so let's imagine, and the screen's gone again, but screw it, I'm just going to keep talking. Let's imagine that my bland pizza base is that node storage, and I want to add something to it, my tomato sauce. Then what I would do is I would extend that class and change that annotation to point to my extension of that class. Now, if someone else wants to add something to it, they're going to do the exact same thing. So that's why our pizza got ruined, because core has this system, because only one can extend that class. So just to recap, and let's go back to our frustrated chef, This fiasco was not that we were trying to do this, we were actually doing this. We were just retaking that same base and adding our toppings on top of it, obviously leading to this disgusting result. So yeah, for those who didn't realize yet, the chef now goes like, oh, okay, now I know why my pizza got ruined. So what we actually need is an assembly line. So with stations along the way, and each station is just one thing, and it doesn't know what happened before it, and it doesn't know what happens after it, and it also doesn't care what came before it or what will come after it. All it wants to do is its thing. That's what the station wants to do. So imagine we have this let's horrify Italian station. Yeah, you've guessed it, we're going to add pineapple to the pizza, obviously. So in that station, it shouldn't have to care what it's receiving. It could receive the bland base, the base with the tomato sauce, or an actual pizza already. It just wants to add pineapple to it. Obviously not the greatest thing if you're an Italian or you actually love fine pizza, but that's what we're doing at the station, okay? So before I continue, for anyone in the room, and probably most of you, if you see this scenario where you don't care what comes before you and what will come after you, it may ring a bell already. So we're talking about decorators, right? And before everyone goes like, oh, god damn it, decorators, yeah, I hated them too. But turns out that if you use them properly, they can actually be a blessing. It's just that generally they're a pain in the ass because you have to like wrap every method, even though you only want to change one. Yeah, it's very annoying. I fixed that, so we'll be fine. So let's have a look at the handler system in group and how we tackle this problem. So in group, we use the new handler system but, with the relations type plugins. This is the new name in group 2, which is set to release somewhere this summer, hopefully. There used to be like the group content enabler plugins, which was a horrible name, but I couldn't find anything better at the time. Now they're called relation types, which will probably still confuse people. So there's just no good name for them, but I've landed on relation type. There is no entry in the annotation whatsoever. So obviously those plugins still use annotations like entity types do, but you do not declare your handlers there anymore because that is where the problem of those magic strings occurs. Instead, you define a service following a specific naming pattern, and it allows for very cool things to happen, which we'll get to later. Those services can be altered by other decorating services, and those services are also completely optional. You can define them, but you don't have to. So those bottom 3 items are the key parts to this system. So let's go over each and every one of them one at a time. So that specific naming pattern, let's just have a look at that one. So essentially it's group dot relation handler and then the type of handler you're interested in and the ID of the plugin that you want to create that handler for. So an example would be group.relation handler and then the post install handler, which is a small handler that runs tasks after you install the plugin for the group nodes plugin. So that would be an example of it. They're lengthy names, I know, but that's just how it is. It's a naming pattern, and these things can get quite lengthy. They can be altered by other services, is what I mentioned earlier. And that is because we don't really have one assembly line, we have 2. So just imagine in your pizzeria that you have a sort of assembly line for your pizza base. Instead of having it bland, you could add cheese to the crust, you could add extra flour, you could do whatever you want to. But this base is then used by all of your pizzas. So whether it's a margherita, quattro stagioni, I don't care what pizza you would like, they all use the same base, but then they have their own assembly line to actually construct a finished pizza, right? So we have, as I just mentioned, we have one assembly line where all the plugin handlers share a same base, and you can add and modify this base at will. And then you have a second assembly line where you have these specific plugins, or in case of your pizzeria, your specific pizzas. And again, this can be altered at will. So let's have a look at those base plugin handlers. So those are normally created by group, and they follow that same naming pattern, but you'll notice that they don't have that .plugin ID at the end. That's because they're the base. So they apply to all plugins and provide same defaults out of the box. Fun thing, group defines all of the ones that group knows about out of the box for you, but nothing stops another module from creating a new handler type and following this naming pattern, and group will just recognize that. So if you need something new, you can define that, and all plugins will be able to use that handler. So it kind of looks like this, that definition. So you can see group.relation handler and then the type of handlers. This is just 3 out of the list. I think I currently have 5 or 6, and one more to come. So you just basically define them as you would in Symfony with a class and arguments, but you'll notice something that you may have not seen before. It says shared false. And this means that, out of the box, when you get a service from Symfony, from the container, you always get the same instance. So the service gets fired up once, it loads up its dependencies, and then you get that service. If you ask for that service again a second time, you get that same instance. Usually this is cool, but here it isn't, because this base class is going to be serving all of the specific handler types for all of the plugins. So the problem with this, if we keep giving the same instance, is that the first time we load it up, let's say for a post-install handler for group node, it thinks that it's dealing with the group node plugin. If then I need the access control handler for group memberships, yeah, that would really suck if the base still thinks that it's dealing with nodes, because we're dealing with memberships. So by setting this flag in Symfony to shared false, whenever we request this service, we get a new copy. And then we can tell that copy what its intended purpose is. So when I said that we can decorate these at will, we're actually just using a really cool feature in Symfony. So Symfony has this notion of being able to decorate a class as many times as you want, and based on the decoration priority, it will wrap certain things first and then the latter and then continue down the line. So I call this a decorator chain. I didn't really find a name in the documentation that suits better, but I think it paints a good picture of what we're doing here. So you'll notice that over here, I provided a pretty lengthy class name, and then in the arguments, it's repeated. Pretty lengthy service name, sorry. But you can name that service whatever you want. This does not follow any naming pattern. You can name it whatever you want, but you have to repeat it and then follow it by .inner to get that whole decoration thing rolling. Starting with Symfony 5.1, you can just use @inner. You don't need to repeat that whole long-ass name, just @inner. Drupal 9 doesn't support that version of Symfony yet, but Drupal 10 will. So as soon as we switch to Drupal 10, I can cut a version of group where all of this is just replaced with @inner, which obviously looks better. And then we have the specific plugin handlers. So these are the ones that you can create. So as you can see, they still follow that naming pattern where at the end you have the type and then the plugin ID. And you can see something special going on here is that they actually request the base plugin as their dependency. And the pieces of the puzzle will fall into place a bit later on, but this is really important because I can actually go over it right now if I want. So imagine this. You have your base handler, which is a service. So there can be any number of decorators for that service. When you request that service in Symfony, you do not get that class that I specified. You get the final decorator in that whole chain, which decorates the one before it, before it, before it, before it, and then you get that base. So here's the cool thing. If I ask for the base here, I'm actually getting the fully decorated chain, which I inject into my specific plugin, which can be decorated again. So then you get a chain of everything in the base that is shared among all of these services, and then you get your chain of the specific one put on top of it. That's where your two assembly lines meet, and you get this really cool system, which leads to a black screen again. And again. So yeah, the arrows. So, but these are all optional, as I mentioned earlier. So where group provides the base handlers, which you can decorate, and if you write a plugin, you're supposed to provide this one, it's actually optional. I'll show you how it's optional later on, but you don't need to specify this yourselves unless you're actually doing something that the base doesn't do. So if you really want to do something specific on top of the base functionality. And decorating the specifics, wow, we're having many issues today. So yeah, it's pretty stuck in there. Maybe on the other side, I don't know. But anyways, so again, you can decorate the specifics just the same way like you could. And again, please note that all of these classes need to be shared false, but it's essentially the same system. So you can see that this instead of decorating the base, this decorates the specific one, right? So let's quickly recap. Instead of that pizzeria where everything went wrong, your pizzeria kind of looks like this now. You have your station at the middle. By the way, this is where I stopped contacting my designer, so the graphics completely look like shit from this point on. So you have your base station in the middle of your pizzeria where you create your base and you can add a cheesy crust and whatever. And then you have your individual tables where you create the specific pizzas. So all of these tables always go to the base to ask for a pizza base. And then they take it to their table, have their assembly line there, and create a fully, hopefully, yummy pizza. So that's much better. Now our chef is happy, right? So now I'm going to hopefully go into the code and it will be readable and the screen will not, screw me over this time. But let's look at some of these points. So we have the optional services. So I explained that you don't need to define them. So this is going to be tiny. So I'm going to try and increase the font size because I don't think anyone can read that, right? So yeah, let's make this a bit smaller and go over here and increase the font size. There we go. So it was 12. Let's put that up to 24. Boom. Okay, there we go. So the service is optional, meaning that we need to look at the group service provider. There we go. So this first part we don't need, so I collapsed that, but here we go. So essentially, Symfony doesn't really allow you to instantiate services that well while you're building the container. So I'm doing some trickery here with the annotated class discovery, but you can see that I have a map here which says, these are the type of handlers that group knows about. And then I'm going to go over all of the plugins and I'm just going to check, like, does this handler exist? Does this service exist? And if it doesn't exist, I'm going to actually create it with an empty access control, empty entity reference. These are basically decorators that decorate the original base, but just do nothing. So what this allows us to do is that anyone consuming the system can rely on the fact that there will be a specific handler. Even if the person who wrote the plugin didn't provide it, there will be a specific handler which you can target with your decorators. Okay, so that's what this here does. So let's go back to the slides. So now let's talk about the manager and how to get a handler. Now this is really cool. Most plugins in Drupal, when you ask for their definition, you get this array, right? Except for the entity type manager. The entity type manager is pretty cool because when you ask for a definition, you get a class which you can ask, some things to, and it also has this notion of handler. So I basically just copied that. So the new in group 2, the plugin handler will work like the entity type handler, which should be a lot better to use. So let's look at that manager over here. And you can see that when we ask for a handler, so we still cache it, because as I mentioned before, when we put that flag shared false, we keep creating a new instance. Obviously, that's not necessary. We just need to make sure that for each type and plugin ID, we get a new instance. But then we obviously want to cache that because otherwise we're creating the same instance over and over and over and over again. So get handler has this little internal cache. But then when we instantiate it, you can see that what I just explained earlier is that we just call that naming pattern group.relationHandler, the type of the handler and the relation type ID, so on this line right here. And that will kick that whole decorator chain into action because I'm requesting this one, which will give me the decorated specific line. But at the bottom of the decorated specific line, I'm injecting the baseline. So that gives us that full chain by just requesting one service, which is really cool in my opinion. So then I do some sanity checking. But obviously you don't need to call create handler instance because then you need to typecast whatever you get back and everything. So we have these handy methods called get access control handler, get entity reference handler, get operation provider, etc. The only reason that this one is actually also public is because, as I mentioned at the start, other modules can create a new handler type. And obviously they can't alter this class. So then they can still rely on get handler or provide their own manager where you can call something that is type that gives you the type that it will return. But that's basically how it works. So every handler has a small interface. Well, and this is important, this is crucial, because I talked about decorators, and you know how much of a pain in the ass a decorator can be if the thing you're decorating has over 20 methods, right? So it's really important that we're smart about how we design our handlers. And this is really tiny right now, but what we can see is that in the plugin folder for group, we have these relation handlers, and there are the interfaces. So for instance, there's this entity reference interface, which just allows you to configure the entity reference fields on a piece of group contents. This could be useful for the group membership plugin, for instance, to add that group roles field, right? And all of them have that. Now, that is because some of the interfaces, for instance, still have multiple methods, but usually it's limited to, like, I think 4 at a maximum. I really try to limit it. But that can still be a pain in the ass. You only want to adjust one and you have to copy all of the others. So what we do for that is we provide a trait. And I expect anyone who will use Group 2.0 to use those traits. I will document this as such, but I preserve the right to introduce new methods to the interface. And if you're using the trait, you will automatically get the bland or vanilla implementations of those new methods. If you're not using the trait and I introduce a new method, it's going to break your code. So I preserve that right because I do provide you with traits. Now, what do these look like? Let's look at that operation provider one, for instance. I'll get to this one in a second because the base also has a trait. So you basically have this trait, and all of the methods are implemented as such. Yeah. Okay, so I think it's going to come back. Is it? Yeah, there we go. So all of the methods are implemented as such. You have your parent check. So we check whether there's a parent, and if there is, we call the parent. And that is basically what I said before. When we create those services for you because they're optional, that's basically what we're doing. We're just calling the parent, we're wrapping this for you. But if you're at the bottom of the chain, if you're the base class, then this will throw an exception saying, hey, there is no parent, so you really need to do something here, right? So if you use this trait, you can choose to override one of these methods, and then all of the rest you don't need to specify because it's calling the parent for you. If we introduce a new method, it does that for you. The base basically works the same, so we have this relation handler trait. It doesn't work the same as that it will call the method for you, but it just sets up the handler for you. So because each specific trait extends the base one, you never really have to tell your handler which plugin ID it's dealing with. The configuration of that plugin, all of that is just loaded into the handlers for you. Okay. And then let's look at an example of one of these alterations. So I mentioned that this is a system that multiple people can alter. So I had to verify that. So if we go into the tests for the module, we have a module called, group test plugin alter. And if we look into that services file, we can see that a bunch of things are going on here. And one of these things is that I have a couple of classes that basically take the admin permission and they just add a little string to the end of it, just for testing purposes. One adds foo, the other adds bar, the other adds baz. It's what we always use when testing. And you can see that with this decoration priority, they're all trying to decorate the base one, except for this one. This is trying to decorate a specific one. So what do these classes look like? Well, they're really very small if you want them to be. So you use that trait, as I said, you have a constructor that sets the parents, and then you just override the one that you want and you do that. And if you want to look at a real world example, we can dive into that too. So we can go into our plugins over here and we can look at a group membership one. So for instance, group membership permission provider. So this is a real example. It basically wow. So at the bottom, if the screen will function. Okay, so at the bottom, it basically does what it's supposed to do. It just calls the parent, except for some edge cases. So if we are dealing with the create case operation for the relation, which would be the membership itself, there is no permission for that because that happens when you join a group. If you want to leave a group, you're basically deleting your own membership. So we rename that to leave group instead of a silly thing called delete own membership. So you can just adjust it like that. You can have some prettier labels, edit own membership, leave group, as you can see. So that's what these do. Now, and this is the beautiful part of this whole system. I can do this, but you can then rename it after. Like we had that station that adds pineapples, you can have a station right after that just removes the pineapples, for instance. Um, and you aren't able to do this in core. So in core, you would just be stuck. Like I would be able, from the outside, here's a real world example that was paid for by the European Commission. They wanted support for content translations. So I would be able to swap out some classes to define new permissions for content translations, but that would be it. No one else would be able to do anything. Obviously, that doesn't work. So I thought, maybe I'll just put it in the base class, the handler that is in group 1.4 at the moment. But then someone from the European Commission said, hey, this isn't really cool either. And I thought it wasn't either, because now we're paying you to put stuff in the base module that some other people might not need. And that's when I came up with this system. Now it's obviously backwards compatibility breaking, so it went into a new major version. But all of this is possible now. You can support any module with just a bunch of services. You don't need to hack group, you don't need to swap out classes, you just define your small microservices and everything works fine. Let's see, is there anything else? No, that was actually it. So I know this was not that much, but because it's just a system with some examples, but I wanted to leave some more room for questions if there are any, which means that I need to grab this little box. Hopefully there are, but first my question to the audience while this thing is booting up, was it clear to everyone? Would you like to see this in core rather than the hot garbage pizzas that we have right now? Yes, obviously. So I haven't started an initiative yet because I still have an initiative for something else that I fixed in group, namely redirect caching, which still hasn't gone into core. So I'm kind of out of courage to start a new one while the other one is still pending. But this is definitely something that I would see as beneficial in core. So my plan would be that I release group 2.0 somewhere this summer. And then hopefully it gets more traction. And then we can, tell core like, hey, this is an awesome part of group. Why don't we have that for everyone? Just like we have entity API, the module, where we often have new features that end up in core. So anyone has a question? Okay. I have no depth perception, so I'm not going to throw this at you because I would just hurt you or land 2 rows short. So here you go. And then please kindly pass it around to anyone else.
So you want to have the system in core, but is changing the system backwards compatible because Drupal doesn't want to break backwards compatible that much on that level of the system because it's really tied to the entity structure?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in order to change this in core, this would need to happen in a major version. And I think they're already working on version 10, which will come out this summer also. So that's a no-go. Maybe version 11 or 12, because major versions allow you to make significant changes. The promise between Drupal 8 and 9 was that we would no longer make that breaking changes so that people can upgrade more easily. But as we noticed between Drupal 7 and 8, at some point you will have a moment where we need to make changes, where it's just no longer feasible. For instance, in Drupal 10, they're upgrading to Symfony 6. That comes with new features. That also comes with the removal of features that Drupal was using. We're going to need to adjust. We always try to keep that level of friction low, but sometimes it needs to be high. So maybe 1 or 2 major releases from now, we can have another one where we say, okay, people, this time it's all hands on deck, a lot of work to upgrade, but it will be worth it. For this, to give you an idea, if you want to upgrade your code from group 1 to 2, it will be similar. Your business logic remains the same. So if you had custom logic in your plugin right now and that needs to move to a handler, or you used one of the old handler systems, you can just copy paste that code. But you need to make small adjustments where it no longer calls the parent as an extension, but it calls the parent as a decorator, right? So you will need to adjust your code, but it shouldn't be that hard. Anyone else? No? Yeah. Try to hit him or something like. Yeah, cool, almost. Better than I would.
I just pulled up an issue that I'd written on the group module, which was to do with access handlers and multiple things in different. Anyway, it doesn't matter what. Proposed resolution: is there a way of chaining the plugin responses? I think you might have fixed that problem.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, this fixes a lot of problems actually. There are many great changes in Group 2 coming that I don't have time to cover all of them in one session. But this is just one. This is basically the tip of the iceberg. There are so many changes in Group. I've provided update functions to make it as easy on you as possible. But essentially, all the things that people were complaining about, I tried to fix. One of the major things that I didn't fix was support for config entities, because I'm still on the fence about that one. But essentially, queries will be faster. Permission calculation will be separated out into a separate module so that other modules like domain, commerce stores, all of those types of specific modules can use that, so that we don't have to keep repeating the same code in our modules, but we can share it. There's lots of cool stuff coming, but this was one of the things that I wanted to share with an audience, because this is something that could actually go into core. Obviously, it will take a lot of time because it's backwards compatibility breaking. Anyone else wants the blue dice with the mic? Blue die with the mic? Nope. So yeah, thank you then. And the screen just said screw you for the 10th time today. So thank you. Before I let you leave, I want to thank the sponsors. Without them, this event wouldn't be possible. I also want to special shout out to Joe Schindler. His session in Dublin might have looked similar to mine today. So years ago, he had this session where he was talking about ice cream. I thought that was a really cool idea, so that's why I'm talking about pizza today. And also, all of these vector graphics came from Vecteezy. I think I have to add that, or they'll sue my ass. But yeah, that's basically it. So thank you.